Welcome to Vinexposium podcast on Wines of the Future. Where are we coming from? Where are we now? And where are we heading? My name is Gabrielle Vizzavona, and with top international experts, we'll be discussing the past, present, and future of the wine industry fast-forwarding 50 years. We are very glad to welcome Carole Meredith for our Wines of the Future talk about grape varieties and everything Vitis Vinifera. Hello, Carole.
Hello, Gabrielle. How are you?
Great, and you?
I'm doing very well, yes.
Carole, you were born in Wales, but soon after you emigrated to California. Keen on science, you eventually narrowed your focus to plant genetics to become the Vitis Vinifera goddess. For 22 years, you were a professor at the University of Davis, California, leading a research group that was amongst the first to use DNA to explore the origins of the grape variety and the genetic relationships between them. You identified the genetic origins of Cabernet Sauvignon, of Chardonnay, of Syrah. You found that the European home of Zinfandel was to be Croatia. And you also discovered the prominent role that Pinot Noir has played in the pedigrees of many French varieties. After commuting from Napa to Davis for many years, you retired from your university position in 2003 in order to focus full-time with your husband, Steve Lagier, on your beautiful vineyard and winery called Lagier Meredith, located in the Mount Veeder district of Napa. So, Carole, what are the most unexpected changes that you acknowledged in terms of grape varieties since you started your career?
It's hard to think of any one thing, but I think something that I have seen over the last few years is the increased openness to trying different varieties in traditional places. I think that when I first got started, which is about, how long ago? That's 40 years ago when I first started working with grapevines. All the European wine regions were very strongly devoted to their traditional varieties. This was not the case in the New World, of course, because the New World has always been, it has had no tradition, and so it's always been open to growing whatever was best suited and also what the market wanted. But in Europe, I have observed that for various reasons, regions have become much more open to the idea that maybe other varieties might be a good choice for them.
We have witnessed a movement since about a decade or so for preservation of autochthonous grape varieties. Where did that come from?
That comes from two places, I think. One is there's increasing interest in the heritage of locations. People in various places have learned more about their history. It's somewhat of a reaction to globalization. We saw in the 80s and 90s a lot of interest in traditional wine regions to producing wines for which there is a global market. And so that means things like Chardonnay, Merlot. Some places began to realize that if they succumbed to economic pressure to plant international varieties for which there is an export market, that they would lose their history and their tradition and their culture. And it made them turn back and look back in time and think maybe they should be more attentive to their traditions and that they were at risk of losing these varieties if they weren't careful. Another reason for looking at the autochthonous varieties, it's a way to differentiate a region in the marketplace. If a region has very distinctive varieties that no other region has, then by focusing on those, perhaps they can call attention to themselves, and no one else can compete with them if they are growing something that is not grown anywhere else in the world.
Which grape varieties do you expect becoming tomorrow's stars worldwide?
Grenache has a bright future. I think Grenache has the attribute of being a traditional variety, both in France and in Spain as Garnacha. It's also well adapted to warm regions. And so I think as some regions get warmer with time, I think Grenache will be a choice that allows them to continue to be traditional in one sense, but also to adjust to a changing climate in another sense.
As global warming becomes an increasing global concern, how could we use grape DNA research to fight it?
We have to be careful about the term global warming because it's not warming everywhere. It's climate change. And the average temperature of the earth is getting higher, but some places are getting cooler and some places are getting warmer. A lot of that has to do with how close a grape growing region is to a large body of water. For example, and of course, California is the area that I'm most familiar with. And here in Napa, we are heavily influenced by the Pacific Ocean. We are on the west coast of North America. The Pacific Ocean at the coast has very cold water. The winds that go across the surface of the ocean waters, they tend to cause a process called upwelling, which drives surface water to the south and allows deeper water to come up from the depths, and it's very, very cold. The water temperature off the coast of Northern California is around 10 centigrade. That very cold water keeps the coastal regions of California quite cool. Sometimes the process of convection, which is warm air rising, as the interior regions of California and North America get warm, that warm air it rises and it draws cooler air in from the coast. So some people are saying that coastal valleys like Napa and Sonoma and some of these central California coastal valleys, they may actually get a little bit cooler over time because there may be more cool air coming in from the Pacific Ocean. So it means that as we look to the future of viticulture, it's not going to be simple. People who are working in viticultural research, I think they need to think about the regions that they are focused on, what the likely future climate will be in that place. Another really important feature for California and also for Chile and Argentina is the importance of mountain ranges as a reservoir for water. The water falls in these mountains as snow, and the snow remains up there for most of the year, and that serves as a natural water storage system. So in California, the snow eventually melts and it flows into rivers, and those rivers flow into reservoirs, which are usually artificial reservoirs that are created by building dams. And so that water then can be stored. But the capacity of these reservoirs was originally designed based upon the snow staying as solid ice for a large part of the year. But with a warming climate, the snow in those mountains is likely to melt earlier in the year, so more of it will flow off as water and go into reservoirs. The capacity of those reservoirs may not be sufficient. So, as far as DNA research, well, certainly adaptation to warmer weather may be really important. Adaptation to drought is obviously vitally important. So yes, it's going to be important to consider how to either consider other varieties, and that's something that has to be kept in mind. Perhaps research can create new varieties, or if not new, then modifications of existing varieties. But there also are thousands of varieties that already exist. So, a big issue, I think, in the future is going to be to what extent are traditional regions willing to adopt new varieties? They have two choices. They can consider some of the already existing varieties, but of course, those varieties have different names and different traditions, and so that's going to mean a big change. The other thing that they can consider, and this is where DNA research comes in, is the possibility of modifying the traditional varieties to make them better adapted to the changing climate. In recent years, it's not so much a matter of genetic engineering in the sense that we came to know it starting in the 80s, where you're putting in big chunks of novel DNA and you may not know exactly how that's going to be expressed. But now with gene editing techniques, and that includes CRISPR and others very similar gene editing techniques, it's possible to make a highly directed and specific change in a single gene of a pre-existing variety. The problem with wine grapes is tradition and history and culture. It's not just the grower who's reluctant. The grower might actually welcome a new variety because it will be easier to grow. But the people who are going to make that wine who have to consider their market. So in that case, yes, if a region can be convinced that different varieties are going to be important for their economic survival, well, then, yes, I think that they certainly will adopt the new varieties. But the more sophisticated consumers will know that and might be concerned, and they might say, this new Bordeaux, it's not the same as the old Bordeaux, and I don't like it, and it's very expensive, so I'm just not going to bother with it anymore because I don't want to spend my money on wine that's not the same as it used to be. And, consumers, sophisticated wine consumers can be very superstitious, and they're not very objective in their appreciation of wines. If they know something about a wine, that's going to influence how that wine tastes to them. So certainly there are genetic tools that could create new varieties or could very subtly and deliberately modify existing varieties, but the acceptance of those is going to be a big issue.
Could we expect the Vitis Vinifera landscape to be fully different in 50 years' time?
I don't think it's going to be very different. No, 50 years is not a long time. So we're talking, 2072. It's going to be a shift, and the shift has started. I mean, the acceptance of some of the new varieties in some of the French AOCs, it already is starting. And I think it's going to be very slow and it's going to be gradual and it's going to vary by region. But I don't think it's going to be completely different. 50 years from now, people will be writing articles about this and they'll look at some regions that haven't changed at all. Like I would say, Napa, I think it's not going to change much at all. Some place like Champagne or Burgundy, that may change quite a bit more. But it's very important not to generalize because viticulture the world over is very, very heterogeneous. You've got different traditions, different histories, different cultures, different climates, different topographies. So some places will change more than others, but overall, I don't think it's going to look strikingly different.
You mentioned Champagne and Burgundy. How would they change?
Because they are quite cool regions and because they are not coastal regions, they're a little bit more continental. And so they may get a little bit warmer in the summer. They may find that their fruit ripens earlier. They may have to adjust their viticultural practices to try to get it to ripen a little bit later when it's cooler. They may be able to make the existing varieties work for a while by adjusting their farming practices and their viticultural techniques, but they will have to consider additional varieties, and I'm sure they're already thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. What is the craziest change you think viticulture could have to face in the next few decades?
It's a traditional industry. Wine is it's a product that is, the marketing of wine is driven by tradition. So it's going to be one of the last agricultural sectors to make huge changes. The changes are going to be very gradual, and I don't think any of them are going to be really crazy.
What do you expect the taste of the wine to be like in half a century's time?
I think it's going to be very much the same because I think that winemaking technology is very, very sophisticated. Winemakers have a lot of tools to make wine taste the way they want them, even if the grapes are coming in a little bit different. I think winemakers have sophisticated methods of adjusting the flavor of the wine. Of course, they can do a lot of blending. Blending may become more important in the future, not just blending varieties, but blending wines from different regions to try to match the traditional profile. I don't see huge changes. I think in other crops, we're going to see much bigger changes because other crops, such as, wheat, soybean, tomatoes, nut crops, those crops are not driven by tradition. They're driven almost purely by economics. And so they will be making big changes.
Will new varieties be discovered?
We will see a few more, but we will see them only in the regions that are forced to consider them. For example, that's the reason why Cornell University in New York has an active grape breeding program. That's the reason why researchers in Germany have for many, many decades had a very active program to develop new varieties. Because of their marginal climates in both regions, they have had to consider new varieties because the traditional varieties, it was a little bit too cold for them. Now, we may find that the situation changes in the future in that some regions are a little bit too warm. But I think that the general rule will hold. It's only those regions that are forced to consider new varieties that will. Every variety that can continue to be successful with traditional varieties will continue to use them because that's so important in the marketing of wine.
Thank you so much, Carole, for your insights about Vitis Vinifera. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
It was a pleasure speaking with you, Gabrielle. I'm sorry that we're not chatting in person, but maybe again someday. Thank you very much, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Carole.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning into Wines of the Future. Don't miss the next episode and subscribe to this podcast. You can also leave us a comment and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Vinexposium.